Now, we're going to talk about something called textual criticism. And textual criticism is the study of manuscripts when we don't have the original. Okay? So if we don't have the original manuscript of something, the original document, and we have copies that have come since then textual criticism is the science, really, that we apply to trying to figure out what the original wording is. This is not unique to the New Testament. We have Old Testament textual criticism. And it's not unique to the Bible. Okay? We can think about something like even Shakespeare's writings, which would be very, very modern in comparison to the manuscripts we're talking about. But Plato, any of Julius Caesar's writings, all of those kinds of things, where we don't have the original and we have copies, textual criticism is the process that we try to look at those copies and discern from that which one preserves the original writing. Now, this is one of those isms that we're going to go over fairly quickly, but it's helpful to understand a little bit about textual criticism. Part of the reason why it's helpful to understand it is I'm going to make two comments about the New Testament that are true, but they can be very badly misinterpreted. Okay? The first comment that I want to make is that we have no original document from the New Testament. Okay? We don't have something where we can say Paul's quill was on this piece of papyrus. We don't have a manuscript where we can say this is the original form, this is the original manuscript of Mark's Gospel. Okay? So there's a term that I want to introduce, and the term is extant. And extant means existing and known. Okay? So we don't have any extant New Testament documents. Now, I don't want to say we don't have any existing, because it is possible that there could be some amazing discovery and we could find something. So extant means, as far as what we have right now, there are no existing and known manuscripts of the New Testament. Originals. We have manuscripts, we don't have originals. Okay, originals are called autographs, and manuscripts are copies. So we don't have any extant autographs. We don't have any extant original manuscripts of the New Testament. Okay? Second comment I want to make, and that is that of all of the copies that we have, and there's something close to 5,800, of all of those 5,800 copies that we have, no two of those copies agree exactly. Okay? No originals, and of the copies we have, no two exactly agree. Now, if I just leave that right there, that sounds pretty indicting. That gets most of us kind of feeling nervous. And those are the statements that often come out when people are saying the New Testament cannot be reliable. We don't have the originals, so how could we possibly know what the original wording was? And of the manuscripts that we do have, they don't agree. So again, how can we possibly know the original wording? So I want to start by talking about this New Testament, how did it come into existence, by pointing out those two things, because those are both true statements. Now, let's put those statements in a context in which they make sense, and we begin to unpack and realize that those are not really indicting statements. First comment, we don't have original manuscripts for any ancient document coming out of this time period. That's not unique to the New Testament. We don't have originals of Plato's writings. We don't have originals of Aristotle's writings. We don't have originals for Julius Caesar's writings. We don't have original manuscripts for any of these writings. That's just the nature of ancient documents, particularly when they were written on papyrus, which is a plant-based writing material. It comes from reeds that grew in Egypt. Okay? That's true for ancient documents in this time period. The second thing that we want to keep in mind is that of the documents that we have that bear witness to the New Testament, of the manuscripts that we have that are copies, it is true that none of them agree in exact particulars. But that could mean that one preserves all of John's Gospel, but another only has part of John's Gospel. In other words, it could be that they don't agree because of the content that they have, the extent of the content. It could be that they disagree with each other because of variant spellings. So for instance, if we think about the man's name Stephen, we can spell that with a PH or a V. Those are variant spellings, but in the right context, we could certainly understand that they're referring to the same person. Okay? I may not know how to spell somebody's name. I've heard that his name is Stephen, but I'm not sure how he spells it, so I may address an email to him and spell it with a PH, but he actually uses a V. It's clear that he's going to know that I misspelled his name, but he's going to know that I'm sending an email to him. Okay? So in the New Testament, we frequently have place names or people's names that are spelled in different ways, like the one I just gave you. Okay? Or we have the different spellings like between British English and American English. So we might have something like honor, spelled in English, H-O-N-O-R, spelled in other parts of the world, H-O-N-O-U-R. It's the same concept. It's spelled differently. So I do want to acknowledge that there are some difficult textual questions in the New Testament, but I want to help us to see right now that those statements really need to be put in their proper context. We don't have the original manuscripts of some of Shakespeare's writings. Now that's even more complicated because he rewrote things and edited them around and did stuff, so we're not always sure which was his intent. But I just want us to see that that statement in and of itself probably describes the majority of ancient manuscripts prior to a certain time period, where we simply just don't have the originals and we have copies. Okay? Now, I also wanted, as I said, to point out that a lot of the differences that we have, discrepancies are of relatively minor importance, and they can be quickly dismissed. So I just want us to understand how to hear certain claims, because as I said, a lot of times those claims are given to us in a way that makes it seem like it's impossible to have any sense of reliability for the New Testament, when that's simply not true. The next thing that I want to just show is as I said, I put on there the necessity and the scope of textual criticism. The necessity is that if we have all of these different manuscripts that at some level are bearing witness to the New Testament, then we're going to have to try to figure out which one of those preserves the original reading. And I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about some technical things pretty quickly, but I want us to understand this just because this is a question that comes up. So this is more kind of in the context of apologetics. But what I want to just say is that if we're going to look at different copies, we need to think about a way to figure out which of those copies preserves the original writing. And I want to make something clear that the way that I've been phrasing that is very deliberate. When we're thinking about New Testament textual criticism, we do not want to be thinking that there are portions of the New Testament about which we're completely unsure as to what the original wording was. Instead, we often have 2 or 3 possibilities, and we're not sure which of those 2 or 3 possibilities preserves the original wording. That's very different, okay? Because under no circumstances in any part of the New Testament are we saying we have no manuscript that preserves the original wording, therefore we do not know what the original wording is. No, we have an abundance of manuscripts, and sometimes we're not sure of the manuscripts, the copies that we have, which one preserves the original wording. That's a very different situation. In other words, we're not in a situation where we're inventing chunks of the New Testament because we don't have any clue what it was. Okay, and I want to be very clear about that because that corresponds to frequently in your Bibles you're going to see some ancient manuscripts have X. Okay, so maybe your translation has given you a reading and then there's a footnote that says some other ancient manuscripts say XYZ. And most of the time, you've already seen from reading those footnotes that they're relatively minor discrepancies. But I just want to make very clear that the necessity is there because we have to figure out of those copies which one preserves the original writing, the original wording. But we also want to be very clear that the original wording is preserved in the manuscripts that we have. Maybe I'll make one final comment that textual criticism is not unique to the New Testament. We talked about that, but I want to underscore that. When we start talking about evaluating manuscripts and the things that I want to say about it, this is not something that we just do for the New Testament. This is an approach to dealing with a problem that we don't have originals. We don't have original manuscripts for this time period in general. So this is something we have to do across the board, okay? Now, this is a chart that I've used in your handout. You'll see this chart. And it's Reclaiming the Mind Ministry. So I've given full credit for it. You can look at the website and stuff like that. I've amended this chart a little bit, but let me say I kind of like and don't like this chart. I like it because it makes a general point pretty quickly, and that's good. I don't like it because the last line that's in red is misleading. So I need to unpack that a little bit. But here's the general point that this chart makes that I think is helpful. What it's trying to do is it's trying to show you ancient writers, when they were writing or when they lived. Some of these are actually when they lived. What's the earliest known copy that we have? What's the time span between the time that it was written and the earliest known copy that we have? And then how many copies do we have? Known. And again, these could change, okay? So we'll just take something like Caesar, okay? Writing about some wars that he won. You don't write about wars that you lose. So he's writing about wars that he's won. And those are his life dates, not his writing dates. The earliest copy we have is about 900 AD. You'll notice a lot of these are about that time period. Partly that has to do with things that were happening in Europe and during the Middle Ages as manuscripts were being destroyed or just wore out, or parts of Europe were in the Dark Ages. There were flurries of activities in different monasteries where classics were being copied. So that partly has to do, those dates there partly have to do with things that were happening in European history. But if you can see, roughly, if we're just looking at the first line, there's about 1,000 years between the time that Caesar was writing things and we actually have copies of that. And I'm taking them on face value on some of their numbers here, but there's about 10 copies we have of that. Okay, we won't go through all of these. We'll just look at Plato. I mean, Plato's writing about 400 BC. Again, when do we have copies of his writings? About 900 are the copies that we have. That's also a little misleading. I always want to be very clear on these things because we do have access to some of Plato's writings because he's quoted by other ancient authors. But that's a quote, so not a manuscript. And about 1,300 years, again, less than 10. I just want you to kind of see the orders of magnitude here, okay? Because when we come to the bottom line, the New Testament written about, I would change some of these dates, about 50 to 95, probably, with Galatians being written probably around 48, and then Revelation being written about 95, and then the earliest copy that we have, 125. Now this is where the chart gets a little bit less clear than I would like. So they say, okay, well, there's only a difference of about 40 years. Okay, what we need to unpack is that we have a teeny little fragment of the Gospel of John that some people claim can be dated to about 125. Okay, already notice that we can't be dogmatic about that. Okay, there's good reasons to take it at an early date, but that can't say beyond a shadow of a doubt 125. And we have to question, too, when was John's gospel written? We're not entirely sure of that. But even if we push back the dates here, you know, I would say I'm probably more comfortable saying that that fragment and John's gospel, we're probably looking at a time period of 50 to 60 years. Okay, not really the 40 years that they give. Again, I don't want anything to be misrepresented. That's why I'm qualifying the chart. And we don't have more than 5,000 manuscripts that date to 125. Okay, so that's something we have to be very careful. Some of our manuscripts really are relatively modern, so to speak. They date to the 12th or 13th century. So that's what I don't like about this last part of it. But what it does show us is, all things considered, the gap between the earliest manuscript that we do have and the latest time period in which the Gospel of John was written, I'll even just make it wide as we can possibly go. Let's say it's even 100 years, which I don't believe it is. But do you see the point that's being made here? It's by the time we get to the New Testament, the gap between the time in which the New Testament was written, notice that that's a span because the New Testament's not all written on the same date, and the earliest manuscript that we have is considerably shorter than other ancient documents. Okay? Now, I personally think this would be better served if we put a figure like 200 over in that early time period, because of really ancient manuscripts of the New Testament, what we have is a couple of hundred. By the time we get to Constantine, where the Bible then is going to be copied by professional scribes, we're going to see a proliferation of New Testament documents. So as it stands, this is why I like and don't like this chart, because it's misleading at the bottom line. It makes it seem like there's over 5,000 copies that are only 50 years from the time of writing. That's not the case. But if we can adjust some of the things that this chart is showing, it still helps us to realize that the time period between the first fragment that we have of the New Testament and when that was likely written is much shorter. And then, let's say we have a couple hundred years between the time of the whole New Testament being written and the manuscripts. That would be maybe 200 or 300 manuscripts. So if we can adjust this chart, it does help us to realize that the order of magnitude of what we're talking about with the New Testament is very different than other ancient writings. And that, to me, is worth the point. Even if that bottom line that's in red there, I think, is misleading.
Do you think is this chart in response to what's perceived as more scrutiny of the New Testament as opposed to these other writings?
Absolutely, absolutely. That's a very fair comment, and that's exactly what it's doing. This is an apologetic ministry, and I appreciate some of the things they're doing very much. But yeah, they're definitely trying to say, hey, look, you hold the New Testament, you say the New Testament's not reliable, and it's held to a vastly different standard than other ancient manuscripts. The point being that many people don't even question the reliability of Plato's Republic, let's say that. And they would say, well, the New Testament is completely unreliable. And so what this chart does help us to see is that we're not talking, that's apples and oranges. We're not talking about the same thing, okay? So, like I said, I like and don't like that chart. This quote, though, Bruce Metzger was an amazing text critic. When he died, the accolades that were given to him came, he was at Princeton for many, many years and solid New Testament scholar. And when he died, the accolades that came and the praises for his work went across the board, evangelical, non-evangelical, just across the board. A person who was really recognized just universally for his work. And so he speaks with a tremendous amount of authority, where he says there's no body of ancient literature in the world that enjoys such a wealth of good textual attestation as the New Testament. So the point that he's making is that when we do all of the comparisons, that chart was just a very quick little overview, but when we do all of the comparisons and look at the New Testament, there isn't anything else like it as far as how well attested it is. Attested means that we have reliable witnesses to what the original wording was. Okay? Now, what that comes down to is a relatively small number of manuscripts that occur very close to the original writing, within 100 or 200 years, and then an increasing number of copies that also attest to the original wording. Now, copies are, good or bad news. If you make a photocopy of something that's got a typo in it and you make 1,000 photocopies of that original that has a typo in it, it doesn't make the original typo go away. It just means 1,000 people know that you misspelled that word. Okay? So copies can go both ways. And I won't get into this in this class, but there is an entire science to classifying the copies. And basically, when we talk about textual families or text types, we're talking about manuscripts that can be linked together because of their errors. They have common errors. Okay, it's kind of a funny way to classify documents by their mistakes, but we're going to talk about some of those mistakes. I know this is technical, but it's what we need as a background for understanding reliability issues. Okay, now I'm going to give you another quote. This is a quote that comes from a book coming out of 1881. But these two individuals here, Westcott and Hort, essentially laid the foundation for the whole discipline of textual criticism as we know it today. Okay? So even though we've discovered more manuscripts since this time, and even though the field of documents out there for New Testament studies has changed, what they're saying has remained intact. Okay? So we're going to look at this, and we're going to unpack this, and then I'm going to give you I like numbers versus word pictures. I didn't do so well on the word picture kinds of things, but I do well when I can see numbers. So I've got these statistics for you in another chart, and just another handout or slide in just a second that give you the statistics, the percentages. But let's just read it first. It may reassure you to know that 7/8 of the time, the different text types, as I said, the different ways of classifying the manuscripts that we have, agree on a reading. If obvious mistakes like skipping a line are left out, Only 1/60th of the readings are in doubt. Only about one word in 1,000 involves both a difference in meaning and serious doubt as to the correct text. No major document of our faith is in doubt because of textual variance. I'm going to unpack that because there's a lot there and I'm not expecting you to get it. Here's the summary. It's saying that 87.5% of the time we have agreement on readings. If we can factor out obvious mistakes, and you're going, skipping a line is not obvious. Well, actually, it really is. Let's just say we have a line that ends the Son of God, and the next line with exactly the same alignment of the letters says the Son of God. And, you know, it's late, you've been working in the fields all day, and the goat just went through the bottom floor. I mean, there's a lot of things that could distract a scribe such that, particularly in the early centuries, where you didn't have trained professional scribes, where you could look at the manuscript, get interrupted, look back, and miss a line, and it's a pretty obvious error. Okay? So that really is a pretty obvious error. So if we can dismiss those kinds of pretty obvious errors, then it means that we have doubtful readings 1.6%. And I'd be willing to go up on this. This is oversimplified. I mean, but it's not, we're not going to go up drastically. Okay, if we were to recalibrate this and say, you know, maybe these numbers are a little bit conservative, we're still not talking about 95% of the Bible, the New Testament is completely unreliable. Okay? So I'm willing to have somebody push back and say, you know what, we need to change those figures. Fine. But we're not going to end up saying that doubtful readings comprise the majority of the New Testament. Does that make sense? Okay, because there's debate on this, and I always like to be fair. I want to be very, very clear. I simplify for the purpose of lecture, but I want full disclosure to say this may be too simplified and fine. But we're still not going to come up with any place where we're going to say the majority of the New Testament is completely unreliable.